People like him don't belong in first class anyway, Karen Davis muttered under her breath, her voice sharp enough to cut through the soft hum of the cabin, yet quiet enough that she thought no one important could hear. That single, careless sentence would soon change everything. But before we dive deeper into this shocking story, drop your city in the comments, hit like, and subscribe so you don't miss more real-life dramas. Now, let's begin. Jamal Carter adjusted the cuff of his tailored Navy suit as he stepped into the first-class cabin of Skylux Airlines Flight PS512, bound from Chicago to Los Angeles at 42. Jamal was the picture of quiet power, CEO of Carter Tech, a silent co-owner of Skylux itself, and one of the youngest black entrepreneurs to make Forbes's Top 100 Innovators list, but as he crossed the plush carpet toward his seat. 2A. He felt something familiar in the air, the subtle shift in tone, the quiet judgment in certain eyes. Karen Davis, the lead flight attendant on this route, greeted passengers ahead of him with flawless smiles and warm charm. "Mr. Langley, welcome aboard. Your Macallan 25 is chilling as requested." She beamed at the retired businessman standing just ahead. But when Jamal approached, her expression cooled like glass dipped in ice water. "Boarding pass," she said flatly. Without eye contact, he handed it over politely, suppressing the tightness in his chest, the one he'd carried since childhood whenever he sensed the silent whispers of exclusion. Karen scanned his ticket, nodded curtly, and turned away without another word. Jamal's lips pressed into a faint line, but he said nothing. He'd learned long ago that power sometimes speaks loudest in silence, settling into his seat. Jamal noticed the storm warning flashing on the cabin display. Thunder cells approaching, expected turbulence. A rumble rolled faintly underfoot as the engines powered up. He opened his iPad, scrolling through slides for the AI conference he'd keynote tomorrow, but his focus drifted. His thoughts slipped back to another storm. Decades ago, when he was 11, sitting in a cramped booth at a diner on Chicago's South Side. He could still see his mother's hands trembling slightly as she returned the menu. "We don't serve your kind here," the waitress had said then, her voice soft, polite even, but crushing in its finality. His mother had taken his hand and left without a word. That memory still lived inside him, carved into his bones. A soft chime interrupted his thoughts. Karen appeared at his row holding a tray. "Mr. Langley, your Macallan 25 neat, just as you like," she said sweetly to the passenger beside him, placing a crystal tumbler with care. Jamal smiled faintly, waiting for his turn. He had pre-ordered the same. But Karen turned, glanced at him briefly, and set down a small glass of orange juice instead. "For you," she said curtly. Jamal blinked, momentarily confused. "Excuse me. I pre-ordered the Macallan 25, he said calmly. Karen's lips curved into something like a smirk. "Out of stock," she replied, then pivoted without waiting for his response. Jamal inhaled slowly, steadying himself. But his instincts told him this wasn't just a mistake. He pressed the call button discreetly. The young attendant Ethan Walsh appeared, looking nervous, almost apologetic. "Mr. Carter," Ethan began softly, "your Macallan is actually available, but Karen's handling the orders today." Jamal's jaw tightened. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make a scene. Instead, he picked up his phone and texted Mia, his executive assistant waiting at LAX. "Log this incident. Watch for a pattern. Within seconds." Mia responded, "On it. FYI. 28 minority complaints in 18 months on Skylux First Class. 9 involving Karen Davis." Jamal exhaled sharply through his nose, his suspicion confirmed. The seatbelt sign pinged on as the captain's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, We're expecting moderate turbulence after takeoff due to storm activity, so please remain seated. Jamal leaned back, deciding to observe rather than act. But his resolve cracked minutes later. Karen returned with the meal trays for the older white businessman beside him. Wagyu steak perfectly seared, truffle mashed potatoes, and sautéed asparagus, plated like art, for the young couple across the aisle. Lobster ravioli and saffron cream, and for Jamal, a turkey sandwich wrapped in plastic, green mold blooming along the crust. The smell hit him before the sight did. He stared at it, stunned. "Is there a mistake?" he asked softly, his tone even. Karen tilted her head and smiled faintly, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "That's what we have left," she said smoothly, as she leaned toward Ethan. Jamal heard her whisper, low, mocking, meant for no one but him. He doesn't belong in first class anyway. The words struck deeper than she knew, but Jamal didn't flinch. Not anymore. He reached under his armrest, tapping the concealed activation switch, unknown to the crew. Jamal had overseen the installation of a discreet cabin surveillance system just 4 months ago as part of a Skylux pilot program, designed to record customer experience issues without disrupting privacy. A soft vibration confirmed it was live, documenting every moment from this point forward. He made a mental note. "I won't just remember this, I'll prove it." Robert Langley, the retired businessman beside him, glanced at the sandwich, then back at his own plate, guilt flickering across his face. But he said nothing. Old habits die hard. Jamal's phone buzzed again. Mia. Confirmed. HR logged 9 similar incidents from Karen, dismissed as passenger misunderstandings. He placed the phone face down on the tray table, his heartbeat steadying. Karen returned minutes later with a tray of piping hot coffee for the other passengers. When she reached Jamal's row, her elbow slipped, sending scalding drops onto the sleeve of his suit. She gasped theatrically. "Oh, I'm so sorry. Sir." The fake sincerity barely hid her satisfaction. Jamal met her gaze, his voice controlled, his tone like steel. "I'll handle it," he said softly, brushing the droplets away. Inside. Though, something shifted. He remembered being 15, shoved against a locker at school, called names he'd never repeat. He'd frozen then. He wouldn't freeze now, without drawing attention. He sent one more message to Mia. "Document this, too, and prepare the boardroom." Because Jamal Carter wasn't just a passenger tonight. He was a silent co-owner of this entire airline. And Karen Davis had no idea. Unbelievable. He actually thinks he belongs here. Karen Davis's whisper was sharp as a knife, slicing through the low hum of the engines as she leaned toward Ethan Walsh near the galley curtain. She thought she was safe, hidden, unheard, but the microphone embedded discreetly in the cabin ceiling captured every syllable. And Jamal Carter, seated just 3 rows away, heard enough to know this wasn't a simple misunderstanding. He sat still, perfectly composed, his fingers resting lightly on the armrest as the cabin surveillance system silently recorded every word, every gesture, every calculated act of disrespect. The luxury of Skylux First Class was designed to make passengers feel valued. Polished mahogany accents, buttery leather seats, curated 5-star meals. But for Jamal, this carefully constructed image cracked like fragile glass with every passing second. Moments ago, Karen had served him a turkey sandwich wrapped in crinkled plastic, spots of green mold blooming along the edges, while passengers around him enjoyed Wagyu steak, lobster ravioli, and vintage caviar service. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't called her out, hadn't played into the stereotype she so clearly expected. Instead, he took a slow sip of water and sent a short, precise text to Mia Torres, his executive assistant waiting at LAX, escalate, HR logs, discrimination files, Karen Davis profile. The reply came less than a minute later. Got it. Found 9 active complaints against Karen in 18 months. 7 dismissed as passenger misunderstandings, compiling reports now. Jamal leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable, but inside, the weight of old wounds pressed hard against the man he had become. Childhood memories, like ghosts, stirred in the corners of his mind, his mother's trembling hand pulling him out of that diner. The taste of shame at 14 when a teacher implied scholarships weren't meant for people like you. The bruised silence of belonging nowhere and everywhere all at once. But Jamal Carter wasn't a child anymore. He was one of the youngest black CEOs on the Forbes list, the founder of Carter Tech, and a silent co-owner of Skylux Airlines itself. Karen Davis, though, didn't know that. And for now, he wanted to keep it that way. The real power, he'd learned long ago, was patience, across the aisle. Robert Langley shifted in his seat, cutting a sideways glance at Jamal's untouched sandwich. Robert, a retired Navy commander and frequent first-class traveler, prided himself on his principles, but old instincts kept his mouth closed. He wanted to believe Karen's treatment was just a mistake, yet deep down, he knew better. For now. He sat frozen, grappling with the uncomfortable weight of his silence. Ethan Walsh, on the other hand, wasn't as steady. The young flight attendant, no more than 25, hovered near the galley, visibly conflicted. He admired Jamal, recognized him from a Forbes profile about Carter Tech's $7.2 billion valuation, and hated being complicit. When Karen passed by with another tray, Ethan leaned close and whispered, "Mr. Carter, I'm sorry about the meal. It's not right." Jamal's gaze softened briefly, but his voice was calm, firm, deliberate. "Do your job." "Ethan," he said quietly, "do it well. The rest will take care of itself." Ethan nodded, swallowing hard, retreating into the shadows of the galley, guilt gnawing at him with every step. Karen returned minutes later, her perfectly styled blonde bun immovable, her smile polished but hollow. She carried 2 cappuccinos and a pot of fresh French-pressed coffee, but when she reached Jamal's row, the inevitable accident came. A sharp jolt of turbulence rocked the cabin as the storm outside clawed at the aircraft, and Karen stumbled just enough for the steaming coffee to spill directly onto the cuff of Jamal's Navy suit. The heat bit into his skin, but he didn't flinch. "Oh my gosh, I am so sorry." "Sir," she gasped theatrically, her hand resting lightly on his arm as if in apology, though her smirk betrayed her satisfaction. Jamal glanced up at her, his voice low and steady. "I'll handle it," he said, brushing the droplets away. His calm more unsettling than any outburst could have been, in his periphery. The small indicator on his smartwatch blinked, confirmation that the surveillance system had logged the spill, and her expression in crisp 4K clarity. Another strike. He thought silently. Behind him. A young black woman seated near the window watched with wide, uncertain eyes, her own past brushes with subtle prejudice coloring the way she interpreted every moment. Her phone rested in her lap, camera app open but recording off, her thumb hovering, unsure if she should intervene or stay invisible. Her hesitance mirrored Jamal's calculated restraint, but where she froze, he strategized. At that moment, Jamal discreetly opened his encrypted app connected to Skylux's internal compliance database, his co-owner credentials giving him access no regular passenger would ever have. A quick search under Karen Davis revealed more than HR wanted anyone to see. 9 complaints logged, 4 with attached photos, 2 involving documented service denial to minority passengers, and 1 flagged as pending investigation, all conveniently buried under internal notes marked insufficient evidence. Jamal's jaw flexed once before relaxing, his breathing even, steady, controlled. He forwarded the entire file to Mia, adding just one instruction: prepare full escalation, include CEO and board-level contacts. Meanwhile, Karen leaned back into the galley, lowering her voice to Ethan. "Watch him," she hissed. "He's trouble. I've dealt with these types before, always looking for a free upgrade, always entitled." Ethan stiffened, saying nothing, but Karen caught the flash of resentment in his expression and smiled smugly, mistaking his silence for loyalty. What she didn't know was that Ethan's smartwatch, issued by Skylux to all cabin crew, was also linked to the same surveillance system Jamal had activated. Her words, her tone, her intent, all logged, time-stamped, and streamed securely to a private server accessible only by Jamal and Skylux's HR head, Sophia Nguyen. As if the universe wanted to punctuate the tension. The aircraft jolted violently, lightning flashing outside the small oval windows, and a collective gasp rose from the cabin. Captain Daniel Brooks' voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." But Jamal noticed something in the captain's tone. Strained, impatient, and oddly dismissive. Within minutes, Karen returned, carrying an alternate entree, cold chicken salad, visibly wilted, served on chipped china. "It's what we have left," she said brightly, as though doing him a favor. Jamal lifted his gaze to hers, silent, unreadable. That silence unsettled her more than anger ever could. 2 rows back, Robert Langley shifted again, guilt finally gnawing past his comfort. He leaned forward slightly and murmured just loud enough for Jamal to hear, "Sir, I saw what she served you. It's not right." Jamal nodded once, the faintest trace of gratitude flickering across his otherwise composed face. That small gesture would plant a seed inside Robert, a seed that would grow into action sooner than anyone expected. At that exact moment, Jamal's smartwatch pulsed with a secure notification. Mia, HR reviewing. Sophia Nguyen monitoring live feed. Evidence lock engaged. Jamal exhaled slowly, his lips barely parting, as though steadying himself for what was coming. Because deep down, he knew this wasn't just about a moldy sandwich or a spilled coffee. It was about patterns. It was about power. And it was about to explode far beyond this cabin, outside. The storm roared louder, lightning slicing the night sky. Inside, the quiet war had already begun, and only one side knew the rules. "Keep an eye on him," Karen hissed to Ethan as she leaned against the galley wall, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping the tray like a weapon. "I've seen his type before. Always looking for trouble. Always trying to get something for free." Her voice was low, but sharp enough to slice through the roar of the engines. Ethan kept his eyes down, his throat tightening as guilt churned in his stomach. But Karen misread his silence as loyalty. What she didn't know, couldn't know, was that every venomous word, every subtle smirk, every calculated act of disrespect had already been captured by the surveillance system Jamal had quietly activated earlier. And now, those recordings weren't just stored. They were streaming live to Skylux's internal compliance servers, where Sophia Nguyen, the company's head of HR, was watching every second in real time. In seat 2A, Jamal Carter sat motionless, his hands folded neatly on his lap, his face calm but unreadable. On the surface, he looked composed, almost detached. But beneath that calm exterior, his mind was working like clockwork, processing every detail, every tone, every possible outcome. Years of being underestimated had taught him one thing: patience wins wars. But patience doesn't mean silence. He was waiting for the right moment. And Karen, without realizing it, was walking straight into the trap she'd built herself. Moments later, Karen returned to Jamal's row, her expression practiced and sweet. "Sir, she said in a falsely polite tone. "We need to ask you to keep your voice down and stop being disruptive." Jamal blinked slowly, his brow furrowing slightly as he looked up at her. "I haven't said a word," he replied softly, his tone even, deliberate. She smiled tightly, ignoring his response, and turned just enough for nearby passengers to hear her next line. "I understand this can be stressful for some people, but we have to maintain order in first class." It was an accusation without evidence, designed to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of those around them. A murmur rippled through the cabin, subtle but unmistakable. Robert Langley, seated beside Jamal, frowned and shook his head slightly, uncomfortable but still silent. 2 rows back, a young businesswoman glanced up from her laptop, watching with growing unease. Jamal leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, and spoke low enough for only Karen to hear. "Everything you're doing," he said evenly, "is being recorded. Every word, every action." For the first time that night, Karen's confident smile faltered, just for a second, almost imperceptibly, before she recovered. "Oh, I'm not worried," she said lightly, forcing a laugh. "You can record all you want." But her knuckles whitened around the edge of her tray, sensing tension rising. Ethan stepped forward hesitantly, whispering to Karen, "Maybe we should just let it go. He hasn't done anything wrong." Karen shot him a glare so sharp it could cut glass. Not another word. "Ethan," she snapped under her breath, "you're either with me or you're against me." Ethan froze, nodding silently, though his conscience burned like fire. At that moment, the intercom chimed overhead, and the deep, commanding voice of Captain Daniel Brooks filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said firmly, "I've been informed of a situation in first class. I expect everyone to remain calm and follow crew instructions." Jamal's gaze lifted slowly toward the ceiling speaker, his jaw tightening just slightly. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't created a disturbance, hadn't done anything beyond quietly requesting the service he'd paid for. Yet here was the captain, already framing him as a potential problem, and Jamal knew exactly why. He'd seen this pattern before. He could almost hear his late father's voice in his head, words spoken decades ago on a rainy Chicago night. "They'll call you angry even when you whisper. They'll call you dangerous even when you're still. But you decide who you are." Jamal exhaled slowly, forcing the tension from his shoulders, refusing to give Karen or Brooks the reaction they wanted. Instead, he reached for his phone, opening a secure line to Mia. "Sophia's watching the feed." He whispered softly, "If Brooks escalates, get legal on standby." Seconds later, Mia replied, "Confirmed. Sophia already looping in Skylux board chair James Patel. Evidence secure." Meanwhile, Karen crossed her arms, positioning herself in the aisle where nearby passengers could see her, carefully crafting the optics of the moment. "Sir," she said louder this time, her tone dripping with feigned authority, "we've had multiple complaints about your behavior tonight. If it continues, we'll have no choice but to involve the captain directly." Several passengers turned their heads, whispers spreading like wildfire. Robert Langley finally spoke up, his deep voice steady but firm. "That's not true," he said loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. "I've been sitting right next to this man the whole time. He hasn't raised his voice, hasn't caused a problem. You're the one escalating this." Karen's cheeks flushed crimson beneath her polished makeup, but she forced a brittle smile and replied, "Sir, please remain seated. We'll handle this." But Robert wasn't finished. He turned slightly in his seat, addressing the passengers around him. "I've served 30 years in the Navy," he said calmly, his voice carrying weight. "I know what fairness looks like, and this isn't it." A hush fell briefly over the nearby rows, and for the first time, Karen felt the fragile balance of control slipping from her grasp. Flustered, she ducked into the galley and tapped her comm button to reach the cockpit. "Captain," she whispered, her voice tight. "We've got a disruptive passenger in 2A. I recommend we divert if this continues." There was a pause on the line before Captain Brooks replied. "Understood. Keep me updated." Jamal overheard the faint exchange from his seat and clenched his fists briefly beneath the table. His breathing slow, steady, controlled. He knew exactly what Karen was trying to do. Build a false narrative, brick by brick, to frame him as a threat. But what she didn't realize was that every brick she laid was being dismantled, piece by piece, by the very system Jamal had put in place months ago. Suddenly, Ethan returned to Jamal's row, crouching slightly to keep his voice low. "Sir," he whispered urgently, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Karen's trying to override the surveillance feed. She's accessing the cabin terminal now." Jamal's eyes narrowed slightly, his voice almost a whisper. "And?" Ethan swallowed hard. "She doesn't have the clearance. The system just flagged her. Sophia's been alerted automatically, for the first time all night." Jamal allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile. "Good," he murmured softly. "Let her try." Minutes later, Karen stormed back into the cabin, trying to mask her frustration beneath forced composure. But Jamal noticed the twitch at the corner of her jaw, the slight tremor in her hands as she gripped her tray. She was starting to realize she was losing control, and that terrified her. Then came the turning point. A nearby passenger, a young man in his 20s, quietly raised his phone and began recording, within seconds. Others followed, subtle at first, then openly, their cameras catching the tension simmering beneath the glossy veneer of first-class luxury. Karen noticed and froze, caught between doubling down and backing off. In the cockpit, Captain Brooks received Karen's latest incident report and made a decision that would change the course of the entire flight. He tapped the comm and announced over the intercom, "Ladies and gentlemen, due to an escalating passenger situation, we are preparing to divert to Phoenix for security purposes." Gasps erupted across the cabin as passengers exchanged confused looks. Jamal sat perfectly still, his expression calm, but inside his resolve hardened like steel. He tapped a single command into his smartwatch, activating a secure notification to Sophia Nguyen. Brooks escalating falsely, evidence ready. "Prepare Phoenix ground team." Less than 30 seconds later, Sophia replied, "Confirmed. We'll be waiting at gate C-22. Do not engage." The storm outside rattled the fuselage as turbulence rocked the cabin. But the real storm was brewing inside, unseen by most. Karen thought she was orchestrating control, but Jamal knew better. This wasn't her stage anymore. It was his. And the curtain was about to rise on the next act, one she would never forget. The intercom crackled above, and Captain Daniel Brooks's voice rolled through the cabin like distant thunder. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to an escalating passenger situation, we will be diverting to Phoenix Sky Harbor for security purposes." A stunned silence swept through first class, broken only by the soft hiss of the air vents and the faint rumble of turbulence beneath the floor. Jamal Carter sat perfectly still in seat 2A, his expression calm, unreadable, but inside, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. This wasn't just discrimination anymore. This was a setup. Across the aisle, Robert Langley shifted uncomfortably, scanning the cabin as murmurs rippled between passengers. A woman clutched her husband's hand tightly, whispering anxiously. The young black woman near the window glanced at Jamal, her phone discreetly raised, recording everything now without hesitation. Karen Davis stood in the aisle, chin lifted, expression perfectly composed, but Jamal saw the faint twitch at the corner of her jaw. She thought she was winning. She thought she was in control. But she didn't know the one thing that would turn this entire situation upside down. Jamal wasn't just a passenger. He was part owner of the airline she worked for, and right now, every word she spoke, every step she took, was being streamed live to Skylux's internal compliance servers, where Sophia Nguyen and the board's legal team were watching in real time. Karen leaned over Ethan Walsh, whispering harshly but loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I'm telling you, he's hostile. He's making people uncomfortable." Ethan froze, his eyes darting toward Jamal, guilt flickering like lightning across his face. "Karen," he whispered, his voice shaking. "That's not true, and you know it." Karen's head snapped toward him, her voice razor sharp. "Do you want to keep your job, Ethan? Then back me up." Ethan swallowed hard, nodding reluctantly. But his silence screamed louder than words. Jamal sat back, folding his hands calmly in his lap, watching the scene like a chess master studying his opponent's blunder. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to argue, because while Karen believed she was writing the narrative, Jamal had already rewritten the ending. The storm outside pounded the aircraft, rattling glasses and making overhead compartments creak, adding a layer of unease to the already tense atmosphere. Then came the moment that would ignite chaos. Karen tapped the cabin comm button, her voice soft but urgent as she contacted the cockpit. "Captain," she said, forcing a tremor into her tone. "I have reason to believe the passenger in 2A may be armed." Ethan's head whipped toward her, his face draining of color. "What?" he whispered fiercely, eyes wide. "Karen, you can't." She silenced him with a glare sharp enough to cut steel. In the cockpit. Brooks stiffened at the claim, his hand hovering over the radio. He didn't ask for proof. He didn't cross-check the manifest. He simply assumed, and within seconds. His voice boomed over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, remain calm and stay seated. Security will meet us upon landing." A wave of panic rippled through the cabin. Gasps, hushed voices, the metallic click of seatbelts being fastened. A woman in row 3 clutched her pearls and pulled her handbag closer, whispering frantically to her husband. Another passenger hurriedly shoved his laptop into his carry-on as though preparing for impact. Robert Langley rose halfway from his seat before Karen barked. "Sir, sit down immediately." His deep voice carried across the cabin. Calm but firm. "Enough," he said, his hand steady on the seat back. "I've sat here the entire flight. This man hasn't raised his voice once, hasn't moved aggressively, hasn't done a thing wrong. You're lying, and you know it." Karen turned sharply, her composure cracking as color rose in her cheeks. "Sir, please, stay out of this," she snapped. But her voice wavered, betraying the control she thought she had. Several passengers began murmuring their agreement with Robert, their confidence bolstered by his steady tone. Across the cabin, cameras began recording openly now, red lights blinking like fireflies in the dim first-class cabin. Jamal remained silent, his breathing even, his hands folded neatly in his lap. But inside, his mind moved quickly, calculating every angle, every move, every consequence. With one discreet tap on his smartwatch, he sent a secure command. "Sophia, priority escalation, threat allegation logged, prepare ground team, FAA notified," less than 30 seconds later. A vibration pulsed against his wrist. "Confirmed, legal and compliance on site at gate C22. Do not engage, stay seated, for the first time since boarding." Jamal leaned back slightly, a quiet calm settling over him. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He was controlling the narrative. Meanwhile, Karen returned to the galley, her breathing shallow, fingers trembling as she scrolled through the cabin control tablet. She tried accessing the surveillance system again, desperately searching for a way to delete the last 20 minutes of recordings, but each attempt was blocked, flashing red with a security override notice. Access denied. The tablet repeated. Administrative clearance required. "What the hell?" she muttered under her breath, her panic rising. Ethan stood nearby, watching her with quiet dread. "Karen," he said softly, his voice breaking, "this isn't going to end the way you think it will." She spun toward him, her voice sharp, defensive. "Stay out of it. Ethan, you're too new to understand how this works." But Ethan wasn't the only one noticing. Passengers whispered quietly, some pulling out their phones to scroll social media feeds where rumors about an armed passenger on Skyluxx PS512 were already spreading. Hashtags began forming. Hashtag Skyluxx scandal, hashtag flight PS512, hashtag passenger rights, climbing fast as early videos from row 3 went live. Back in the cockpit, Brooks contacted Phoenix Ground Control, requesting an emergency security team upon landing. But what he didn't know was that Sofia Nguyen had already called ahead, coordinating directly with Skyluxx's Phoenix division, FAA representatives, and federal security officers. Every second, Karen believed she was tightening the noose. Sofia was pulling the rope from the other end. Suddenly, a small voice cut through the tension. A little boy in row 4, his eyes wide with fear as he clutched his mother's sleeve. "Mommy," he whispered, "is the bad man gonna hurt us?" The words pierced Jamal's composure like glass splintering beneath weight. He turned his head slowly, meeting the boy's gaze with calm reassurance, offering a gentle smile. "No one's going to hurt you," he said softly, his voice steady, soothing. That simple kindness rippled across the nearby rows, grounding the atmosphere just as panic threatened to take over. Karen saw it too, and it enraged her. Her control, her carefully built facade, was slipping fast, desperate to reassert authority. She moved quickly to the cockpit, whispering fiercely to Brooks. "We need to get him off this plane," she insisted. "He's intimidating passengers, refusing orders. He's a safety risk." Brooks frowned slightly but nodded, his biases blinding him to the lack of evidence. "Fine," he muttered. "We'll let Phoenix handle it." Back in the cabin, Robert Langley leaned closer to Jamal, his voice low but firm. "Sir," he said quietly, "I know I've been silent too long, but I won't be this time. Whatever happens in Phoenix, I'm standing with you." Jamal turned his head, studying the man briefly before nodding once in silent acknowledgement. The bond was unspoken, but it was enough. The aircraft banked sharply as descent began, the lights dimming slightly as they dropped through the storm clouds. The cabin grew tense and hushed, the air thick with unease and expectation. Jamal's smartwatch pulsed again. "Sofia, Phoenix team ready, full evidence compiled, do not respond to accusations, we control the narrative," for Jamal. The pieces were finally aligning, every insult, every lie, every manipulation, recorded, time-stamped, and backed by irrefutable evidence. Karen thought she was winning this battle. But what she didn't know was that the war had already been lost. Outside. Rain streaked the windows as the aircraft lined up for approach, the lights of Phoenix glittering faintly below. Inside. Silence settled heavy over first class, broken only by the captain's voice announcing final descent. In less than 15 minutes, the truth would come crashing down, and for Karen Davis, Daniel Brooks, and Ethan Walsh, life would never be the same again. The wheels touched down at Phoenix Sky Harbor with a sharp screech, the cabin jolting as reverse thrusters roared and lights from the runway streaked past the windows. A thick, tense silence settled over first class, broken only by the faint hiss of the air vents and the click of seatbelt buckles unlocking. Jamal Carter sat motionless in seat 2A, his hands folded neatly on his lap, his expression unreadable, but inside his focus sharpened to a razor's edge. He knew this was the moment everything shifted. As the aircraft slowed to a crawl, Karen Davis stood near the galley, her hands clasped tightly behind her back, her smile strained but practiced. She still believed she controlled the narrative. She still believed the security team outside those cabin doors had come for Jamal. But the truth, carefully set into motion hours ago, was about to hit her like a tidal wave. A soft chime sounded as the seatbelt sign switched off, and almost instantly, the cockpit door opened, revealing Captain Daniel Brooks, his face tight with authority, his voice carrying through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "please remain seated while airport security boards the aircraft. There's an ongoing investigation into a passenger-related incident, and we appreciate your cooperation." Several passengers exchanged nervous looks, whispers rippling like wind through leaves. Cameras came up again, recording discreetly and openly alike, their tiny red lights blinking as anticipation thickened. Jamal remained still, his breathing slow, controlled. He didn't have to speak yet. The truth was walking toward him. The front cabin door opened with a sharp metallic click, and 4 figures stepped inside. Sophia Nguyen, Skylux's head of HR, her expression composed but cold. 2 FAA compliance officers in navy jackets with gold insignias, and a Phoenix airport security lead in a dark uniform, face set with calm professionalism. Behind them, 2 Skylux board representatives stood quietly observing, including James Patel, the chairman himself. Karen's confident smile widened as she stepped forward eagerly, pointing directly at Jamal. "That's him," she said sharply, her voice steady, loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "He's been disruptive, aggressive, and refusing instructions the entire flight. I recommend he be escorted off immediately." But Sophia didn't move toward Jamal. Instead, she raised a single hand, stopping Karen mid-sentence, her voice measured and icy. "Karen Davis," she said calmly. "Please step forward." Karen blinked in confusion, hesitating. I'm sorry?" Sophia's tone didn't waver. "You, Ethan Walsh, and Captain Brooks are required to accompany us to the jet bridge for questioning regarding misconduct during this flight." A ripple of shock swept through the cabin, whispers exploding louder now. Robert Langley sat forward abruptly, his voice carrying clear authority. "About time," he muttered, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. Karen's composure faltered as color drained from her face. I don't understand," she stammered, forcing a laugh. "You've got the wrong person. He's the problem." But Sophia cut her off sharply, her voice like steel. "We've reviewed the full surveillance feed from this cabin," she said, her words deliberate and heavy with finality. "Every interaction, every statement, every whisper. You are on record mocking a passenger based on race, serving him spoiled food, falsifying claims of aggression, and attempting to access secured systems to erase evidence." Karen froze, her mouth opening but no sound emerging. Passengers gasped audibly, several lifting their phones higher, capturing every second. Ethan shifted nervously beside her, guilt etched across his pale face, while Captain Brooks stepped forward defensively, his voice sharp. "Hold on," Brooks interjected. "I made decisions based on my crew's reports. If there was any misunderstanding, Sophia turned her gaze to him, calm but unyielding. "You ordered an unscheduled diversion without verifying claims, filed a false FAA security threat report, and failed to investigate passenger complaints. You will answer for those decisions." Brooks's jaw tightened, his eyes darting briefly to Karen, realizing for the first time how deeply he'd been pulled into her narrative. Karen finally found her voice, her tone rising in desperation. "You can't just fire me. You need my union rep. I've worked here 8 years. Sophia's expression remained composed. "Your employment status will be addressed after the formal inquiry," she said flatly, "but effective immediately. You, Ethan Walsh, and Captain Brooks are relieved of duty and removed from this aircraft." Gasps erupted through the cabin, and Ethan's face collapsed as the words hit him like a blow. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it, his shoulders slumping in silent resignation. Karen, on the other hand, wasn't done. "This is insane!" she snapped, her voice rising sharply. "You're protecting him! You don't even know who he is!" And then it happened. The moment that silenced the cabin completely, Jamal Carter stood slowly, straightening his tailored Navy suit jacket with calm precision. His presence carried a weight that needed no introduction, but his voice, low and steady, cut through the chaos like thunder rolling through a storm. "Actually," he said softly, "they know exactly who I am." Karen turned sharply toward him, her breath catching slightly as their eyes met. "My name," Jamal continued, his tone deliberate, "is Jamal Carter, CEO of Carter Tech, and for the past 5 years, I've been a silent co-owner of Skylux Airlines, this aircraft, this cabin, this company." He paused just long enough for the weight of his words to sink in. "I own 15% of it." A stunned silence blanketed the cabin, the hum of the engines the only sound for a moment that seemed to stretch forever. Robert Langley's eyebrows shot up, and a low murmur spread through the passengers like wildfire, phones rising higher, cameras zooming in to capture every angle. Karen staggered back a step, her face pale, her carefully constructed confidence collapsing in real time. You own?" she whispered, her voice trembling, her mind scrambling to comprehend how badly she'd miscalculated. Jamal's expression remained calm, his voice measured but unyielding. "I've spent my life working to ensure people are treated with dignity and respect," he said softly, but firmly. "What happened on this flight, the insults, the spoiled food, the lies, isn't just unprofessional, it's unacceptable, and it ends today." The passengers erupted into applause, the sound rising like a wave rolling through the cabin. Some cheered quietly, others clapped loudly, their voices murmuring words like "finally" and "justice." Robert Langley stood halfway, clapping once before sitting again, his jaw set in quiet solidarity. Karen's breath came in shallow bursts now, her entire body trembling as Sophia gestured toward the jet bridge. "Ms. Davis," Sophia said firmly, "you will come with us for a moment." Karen hesitated, her gaze darting from Jamal to the recording passengers to the FAA officers standing by. Finally, with her head bowed, she turned and walked slowly down the aisle, followed by Ethan and Brooks, their once commanding presence stripped to silence. As the cabin door closed behind them, Sophia turned back to Jamal, her expression softening for the first time. "Mr. Carter," she said quietly, "on behalf of Skylux Airlines, I apologize for what you've experienced tonight." Jamal shook his head lightly, his voice calm but firm. "Don't apologize to me," he said softly. "Apologize to every passenger on this plane who had to witness it." Sophia nodded once, deeply, before addressing the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, effective immediately, the crew responsible for tonight's incident has been relieved of duty. A new crew is on standby to continue your journey, and Skylux will be compensating all passengers with full refunds, 7 years of elite status, and a $12,500 inconvenience credit." Gasps of disbelief filled the cabin, quickly followed by cheers and grateful murmurs. Jamal remained seated, silent again, his composure intact, but inside, his mind was already moving beyond this flight, beyond Karen, beyond Brooks. This was bigger now. This wasn't just about him. It was about change. As Sophia exited the cabin to oversee the offloading, Robert Langley leaned closer, his voice low but filled with conviction. "I've seen a lot in my life, Mr. Carter," he said softly, "but tonight feels like the start of something bigger." Jamal glanced at him, a faint nod his only reply. But deep down, Robert was right. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. And for Skylux Airlines, the turbulence had only just begun. The cabin door closed behind Karen Davis, Ethan Walsh, and Captain Brooks with a muted thud, the sound heavy with finality, for a brief, suspended moment. First class sat in stunned silence, as though the air itself was holding its breath. Then, slowly, the hum of whispered conversations rose like a tide, passengers leaning across aisles, murmuring in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. Phones were out everywhere now, recording, live streaming, sharing snippets of the confrontation with captions exploding across social media. CEO secretly owns airline. Racist crew fired on the spot, and Skylux flight PS512 turns into history-making showdown. Within minutes, hashtags began trending. Hashtag Flight for Justice. Hashtag Skylux Scandal. Hashtag Jamal Carter. Jamal sat quietly in seat 2A, still and composed, his fingertips resting lightly on the edge of the armrest. But inside, 1,000 thoughts churned beneath the calm surface. He wasn't thinking about Karen anymore. Not Ethan. Not even Brooks. He was thinking about his father, about the man who'd worked 30 years at the South Side Post Office, who had endured humiliation and prejudice so his children wouldn't have to. He thought about the nights his mother would come home from double shifts, her uniform still smelling of fryer grease, whispering, "One day, you'll sit where they can't ignore you." And now, here he was, in this moment. He felt the weight of their sacrifices pressing against his chest, steadying him as he prepared to speak. The intercom chimed softly as Sophia Nguyen stepped back into the cabin, standing just beside Jamal's row, her voice clear but respectful. "Mr. Carter," she said gently, "the passengers are unsettled, and many have questions. Would you like to address them?" Jamal looked up at her, nodded once, and rose to his feet, adjusting the cuff of his suit jacket with deliberate calm. The cabin fell silent almost instantly, every eye turning toward him, every phone camera rising like a constellation of tiny red lights. His voice, when he finally spoke, was steady, deep, carrying the quiet authority of a man who didn't need to shout to be heard. "First," he began softly, "to everyone on this flight, I want to thank you for your patience, for your calm, and for standing with the truth." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "What you witnessed tonight should never happen to anyone, anywhere, in any cabin, and I promise you, it won't happen here again." A soft murmur of agreement rippled through the rows, passengers leaning forward, listening intently. Jamal continued, his tone warm but resolute. "You've seen enough already, but I need you to know this. Skylux Airlines isn't just any airline to me. For 5 years, I've been a silent co-owner. I invested because I believed this company could set a new standard for dignity, respect, and fairness. Tonight, that standard failed. And for that, I take responsibility." Gasps echoed faintly across the cabin as several passengers exchanged looks, surprised that someone of his stature would admit fault when he wasn't personally to blame. A woman in row 4 dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, whispering softly to her husband. He didn't have to say that. Jamal scanned the cabin slowly, meeting the eyes of passengers one by one, his voice lowering slightly, making the moment intimate despite the crowded space. "You deserve better, every one of you." He gestured toward Sophia, who stepped forward to speak. "Effective immediately," she announced, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Skylux will issue full refunds to every passenger on this flight, grant 7 years of elite status, and provide a $2,500 credit toward future travel." Gasps erupted louder this time, followed by scattered applause that quickly built into a wave of cheers and gratitude. The businessman seated in 3C raised his glass of sparkling water in silent acknowledgement, while the young couple near the window clasped hands, shaking their heads in disbelief. For some, it wasn't just about the money. It was about being seen, being valued, being respected. The atmosphere in first class shifted palpably, from tension and unease to relief and solidarity. But Jamal wasn't finished. Compensation is one thing, he said, his tone deepening slightly. But change is another, and change is what matters. He turned slightly, speaking now not just to the passengers, but to the cameras he knew were already streaming to millions online. This isn't just about me, he said slowly. It's about the 92 complaints before mine, the ones dismissed, the voices ignored, the stories erased. That ends now, starting tonight. Skylux will review every unresolved case. Every voice will be heard. And starting next month, we're launching the Dignity Protocol, mandatory anti-discrimination training, real-time surveillance auditing, and a passenger advocacy hotline staffed 24/7. Sophia nodded behind him, confirming with a quiet, firm yes. As she made a note on her tablet to push the announcement to press channels within the hour, then something unexpected happened. A young black woman from row 5 stood slowly, clutching her phone in one hand, her voice trembling slightly. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, "I want to thank you. I've been through something like this before, and I stayed quiet. But tonight," she glanced at the other passengers, then back to him. "Tonight, I don't feel invisible." A hush swept across the cabin as Jamal met her gaze, his expression softening. "You've never been invisible," he said gently. "None of you have. Sometimes the world just needs reminding." Across the aisle, Robert Langley cleared his throat, standing halfway, his voice deep and steady. "Mr. Carter," he said firmly, "I was wrong to stay silent earlier. I saw what happened, and I should have spoken up sooner. But you've reminded me tonight that silence helps no one. From here on out, you have my voice and my respect." Jamal extended a hand, shaking Robert's firmly. Their quiet exchange met with another round of applause from the surrounding passengers. In that moment, solidarity wasn't just a word. It was alive, breathing, tangible. Phones captured it from every angle, streams climbing past 2,000 live viewers in under 20 minutes. Headlines exploded online. Skylux Flight PS512 becomes turning point in aviation history and passenger turns silent co-owner. Fires racist crew mid-flight. TikTok clips replayed Karen's insults, contrasting them with Jamal's calm composure, while YouTube live streams broadcast Sophia's announcement on passenger rights reforms. The flight had become a global flashpoint, a mirror reflecting far more than a single incident. Jamal eased back into his seat as the applause died down, exhaustion washing over him like a slow tide. He exhaled, eyes closing briefly, letting the relief sink in, not because he'd won, but because something bigger than himself had begun. Skylux's reputation, his own principles, the dignity of every passenger here, all now tied together. Sophia approached him quietly, leaning close so only he could hear, the boards watching the live streams. She whispered softly, "They're backing you. Jamal, every reform, every policy. This is the moment." He nodded once, eyes still closed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then let's make it count." Minutes later, the new crew boarded, led by Captain Elizabeth Moore, her crisp uniform and steady demeanor immediately setting a different tone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said warmly over the intercom, "on behalf of Skylux, I assure you, the rest of your journey will be handled with the dignity and respect you deserve." A collective sigh of relief rolled through the cabin, shoulders loosening, tension dissolving like mist in sunlight. As Jamal looked around, he saw something he hadn't expected. Passengers talking to each other, laughing softly, sharing stories, connecting through shared experience. Strangers moments ago, allies now, and for the first time all evening. Jamal allowed himself a small, genuine smile. He glanced at his smartwatch as another secure notification appeared. Passenger videos trending #1 worldwide. Flight PS512 now at 3.4 M live viewers. Statement requested. He took a slow breath, knowing this was no longer just about one flight, one crew, one man. This was bigger. The cameras, the headlines, the policies. This was the beginning of a systemic shift, and Jamal Carter had just become its catalyst. 9 months later, the world still remembered Skylux's flight PS512. What began as a humiliating act of discrimination at 35,000 feet had ignited one of the most significant policy overhauls in modern aviation history. The video footage, Karen's whispered slurs, the moldy sandwich, Jamal Carter's quiet composure, had been viewed over 118 million times across platforms, earning the viral name The Flight for Justice overnight. Skylux had faced relentless public scrutiny, congressional inquiries, FAA investigations, and lawsuits from advocacy groups demanding systemic reform. Yet instead of crumbling, the company rebuilt itself. From the inside out, under Jamal's leadership, Skylux launched the Dignity Protocol, a sweeping set of passenger rights protections requiring mandatory anti-bias training for all crew members, real-time surveillance audits on every flight, and an independent passenger advocacy council to investigate complaints without corporate interference. FAA adopted elements of the program nationwide, making PS512 a federal case study in equity and accountability. And the results were undeniable. In less than 9 months, discrimination complaints dropped by 72%, customer satisfaction soared to record highs, and Skylux's revenue jumped 22%, setting a new industry standard. Jamal's name, once known only in tech circles, became synonymous with quiet strength and systemic change. Yet for him, this journey wasn't about headlines or statistics. It was personal. Sitting in his glass-walled Carter Tech office overlooking downtown Chicago, Jamal glanced at a framed photo on his desk, his mother in her diner uniform, smiling despite the exhaustion etched in her eyes. That old memory of her being refused service decades ago had haunted him for years, shaping the man he became now. Every reform, every policy, every protection put in place was for her, and for everyone who'd ever been made to feel invisible. But some scars healed slower than others. That afternoon, Skylux hosted a private ceremony at its Los Angeles headquarters, honoring the PS512 Passenger Advocacy Initiative and unveiling a plaque dedicated to the passengers who stood up for truth on that turbulent night. Among the invitees was Robert Langley, the retired Navy commander whose decision to speak up mid-flight had shifted the power dynamic forever. He clasped Jamal's hand firmly, his voice low and steady. "You turned turbulence into transformation. Son," he said warmly, proud to have been there. Jamal smiled faintly, nodding in gratitude. But just as the ceremony wrapped up, Sophia Nguyen approached him cautiously, her expression unreadable. "Jamal," she said quietly, "someone's here to see you." He turned, and for a moment, the noise of the room faded into silence. Standing by the entrance was Karen Davis. Time had changed her. The polished arrogance was gone. She wore no makeup, her blonde hair tied simply at the back, her posture humbled, shoulders slightly slouched. In her hands, she clutched a small envelope. Sophia hesitated before whispering, "She requested this meeting weeks ago. Said she wants to apologize." Jamal's gaze remained steady, unreadable, as he gestured toward a quiet corner of the atrium. Karen approached slowly, stopping a few feet away, her voice soft, almost breaking. "Mr. Carter, I know I'm the last person you want to see," she began, her hands trembling as she clutched the envelope tighter. "I've replayed that night in my head 1,000 times, and every time I hate the person I was on that plane." She drew a shaky breath, glancing briefly at the floor before meeting his eyes again. I grew up believing things I never questioned, until that night forced me to. I was wrong. About you. About so many people. And I'm sorry. Her voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment, silence hung between them. Jamal studied her carefully, his expression calm but measured. Do you know why I didn't lash out that night? Karen? He asked softly, his tone neither sharp nor forgiving, simply honest. She shook her head slowly, tears welling in her eyes. Because anger changes moments, he continued quietly. But patience changes systems. I wasn't fighting you. I was fighting something bigger, and I had to win. Karen's breath caught, a single tear slipping down her cheek as she nodded, absorbing the weight of his words. She extended the envelope toward him, her voice barely above a whisper. It's a letter, she said softly. Not for now. For whenever you're ready. Jamal accepted it silently, slipping it into his jacket pocket without opening it. Then, after a pause, he said gently, I can't erase what happened, but you can decide who you are moving forward. Karen nodded, her shoulders shaking slightly, before turning to leave. For the first time since PS 512, she walked away not as an antagonist, but as someone beginning her own journey of reckoning, as she disappeared into the crowd. Sophia approached Jamal quietly, placing a hand on his arm. You didn't have to meet her, she said softly. Jamal glanced out the tall glass windows at the Los Angeles skyline, his voice steady. I did. He replied simply, because change isn't real if we only demand it from others. Outside. Cameras flashed as reporters gathered near the street, eager for a statement. But Jamal didn't walk toward them. He didn't need to. The story had already been written, in policies, in progress, in people's lives transformed by what happened that night. As he walked toward the exit, Robert Langley caught up beside him, clapping a hand on his shoulder. So, Robert said, his tone warm, teasing. Think you'll ever take another Skylux flight after all this? Jamal smiled faintly for the first time that day, his voice low but resolute. Yes, he said simply, because now, it's safe, for everyone. And with that, he stepped into the sunlight, knowing the turbulence of PS 512 would never define him, but the change born from it always would. Thank you for watching this emotional story. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next video. Your support means the world to us.